Hi, you're a person living in the 21st century. You've got smartphones, global trade, privatized industries, and probably some strong opinions about free markets. But have you ever wondered how we got here? Well, about 40 years ago, Britain was a completely different place. The government owned pretty much everything, unions could shut down entire countries, and economic stagnation was just a fact of life. Then, along came this woman with a handbag and some very strong opinions about how the world should work. Her name was Margaret Thatcher, and she didn't just change Britain. She changed everything. Like, literally everything. The way governments work, the way economies function, the way people think about the role of the state. Even if you've never heard of her, you're living in the world she helped create. But here's the thing. Most people have absolutely no idea what she actually did. They know she was called the Iron Lady, they know she was controversial, and they probably have some vague sense that she liked capitalism. But the full story? The complete transformation she unleashed on the world? That's what we're diving into today. By the end of this series, you'll understand exactly how one person managed to reshape global economics, redefine conservatism, and create the modern world we live in today. We're talking about privatization on a scale never seen before, economic policies that countries around the world copied, and social changes that are still playing out decades later. But first, let me give you some context for just how radical this transformation was. Picture this. It's 1979. Britain is known as the sick man of Europe. Inflation is through the roof, and the previous government literally had to go begging to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. The country was falling apart. Garbage piling up in the streets, bodies going unburied, electricity getting cut off. This wasn't some developing nation we're talking about. This was one of the world's major powers, and it was collapsing. Most politicians would have tried to manage the decline. Maybe tinker around the edges, make some small reforms, hope things got better. Not Margaret Thatcher. She looked at this mess and said, "You know what? We're going to tear the whole thing down and build something completely different." And that's exactly what she did. Now, to understand what made Thatcher so revolutionary, we need to go back to her beginnings. She wasn't born into wealth or privilege. Her father ran a grocery store in a small town called Grantham. But here's what's interesting. Even as a child, she was obsessed with politics and economics. While other kids were playing games, young Margaret was reading about fiscal policy and attending political meetings. This background shaped everything about her worldview. She understood business from the ground up, she knew what it meant to work for a living, and she had zero patience for economic theories that didn't work in the real world. When she looked at Britain's problems, she didn't see them as inevitable. She saw them as the result of bad policies that could be changed. The Britain she inherited was built on a completely different philosophy. Since the end of World War II, both conservative and Labour governments had basically agreed on the same approach. Big government, high spending, state ownership of major industries, and cooperation with powerful trade unions. This was called the post-war consensus, and it had dominated British politics for 30 years. But by the 1970s, this system was breaking down spectacularly. The government owned everything from coal mines to car factories to airlines, and most of these industries were losing massive amounts of money. The unions had become so powerful, they could essentially hold the entire country hostage. Inflation was destroying savings and making long-term planning impossible. Other politicians saw these problems and proposed minor adjustments. Maybe negotiate better with the unions. Perhaps improve management in state-owned companies. Thatcher looked at the same situation and reached a completely different conclusion. The entire system was fundamentally wrong and needed to be replaced. This is where things get really interesting, because Thatcher didn't just want to fix Britain's economy. She wanted to prove that there was a better way to organize society itself. She believed that free markets weren't just more efficient than government control. They were morally superior. In her view, capitalism didn't just create wealth, it created freedom. Most people think economics is boring, but for Thatcher, it was a moral crusade. Every state-owned industry represented government power over individual choice. Every regulation was a limit on personal freedom. Every tax was money taken from people who earned it and given to politicians who didn't. So when she became prime minister in 1979, she didn't just implement new policies. She launched what can only be described as an economic revolution. And the first target was inflation, which was running at over 20% per year. Most governments would have tried to control prices directly or negotiate with unions to keep wages down. Thatcher did the opposite. She deliberately triggered a recession, on purpose, because she believed that only by squeezing inflation out of the system could Britain have a healthy economy in the long term. It was an incredibly risky strategy that caused unemployment to skyrocket and made her deeply unpopular. But she stuck to it, because she was playing a much longer game than anyone realized. While the recession was crushing traditional industries, something else was happening. New businesses were starting up. Entrepreneurs were taking risks. Innovation was accelerating. The old, inefficient ways of doing things were being swept away and replaced by something dynamic and competitive. But the real transformation was just beginning, because while Thatcher was squeezing inflation out of the economy, she was also preparing for the most ambitious privatization program in modern history. We're talking about taking industries that had been government-owned for decades and selling them to private investors. This sounds normal now, but at the time it was absolutely revolutionary. No major democracy had ever attempted anything on this scale. The conventional wisdom was that certain industries were natural monopolies that had to be run by the government. Utilities, telecommunications, transportation, these were considered too important to be left to private companies. Thatcher disagreed. She believed that competition would make these industries more efficient, more innovative, and more responsive to customers. But more than that, she saw privatization as a way to fundamentally change British society. If ordinary people owned shares in these companies, they would have a stake in capitalism's success. The first major privatization was British Telecom in 1984. The government's telephone monopoly was sold to private investors in the largest share offering in British history. Millions of ordinary people bought shares, many for the first time in their lives. It was a massive success that raised billions for the government and proved that privatization could work. But this was just the beginning. Over the next few years, Thatcher privatized gas, water, electricity, airports, airlines, car companies, steel companies, and dozens of other industries. Each privatization was carefully planned to maximize competition and minimize government control. The results were extraordinary. Industries that had been losing money for decades suddenly became profitable. Customer service improved dramatically. Innovation accelerated. Prices often fell even as quality increased. More importantly, the privatizations created a completely new relationship between citizens and the economy. Instead of being passive recipients of government services, millions of people became shareholders in the companies that served them. They had a direct financial interest in economic success. This transformation wasn't just happening in Britain. Countries around the world were watching Thatcher's experiment with intense interest. If privatization could work in Britain, maybe it could work anywhere. The ideas she was implementing would soon spread across the globe, reshaping economies from New Zealand to Chile to Eastern Europe. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because while Thatcher was revolutionizing the British economy, she was also facing the biggest political battle of her career. The trade unions weren't going to give up their power without a fight, and the confrontation that was coming would determine whether her revolution could succeed. The showdown came in 1984, and it wasn't just any industrial dispute. This was the miners' strike, and it would determine whether Britain's future belonged to elected governments or powerful unions. The National Union of Mine Workers, led by Arthur Scargill, declared war on Thatcher's policies. They weren't just fighting for jobs or wages. They were fighting for the entire post-war system that Thatcher was dismantling. Scargill believed he could bring down the government the same way the miners had toppled Edward Heath's Conservative administration a decade earlier. He was wrong. Thatcher had been preparing for this confrontation for years. She'd built up coal stocks, diversified energy supplies, and carefully studied every previous miners' strike to understand their tactics. When the strike began, it looked like it might work. Entire mining communities shut down. Violent clashes erupted between strikers and police. The media portrayed it as a battle for Britain's soul. But Thatcher refused to negotiate with what she called the enemy within. She understood that if she backed down, her entire reform program would collapse. The strike lasted almost a year. Families were torn apart. Communities were devastated. But Thatcher held firm because she knew this was about much more than coal mining. This was about whether democratically elected governments could govern or whether powerful interest groups could veto policies they didn't like. When the miners finally returned to work without achieving any of their demands, it marked a fundamental shift in British politics. The age of union power was over. Future governments, whether conservative or Labour, would have to find new ways to manage the economy without giving veto power to organized labor. But Thatcher's revolution wasn't just about breaking union power. It was about creating an entirely new economic culture. She wanted to turn Britain from a nation of employees into a nation of owners. The privatizations were just one part of this strategy. She also launched the largest expansion of homeownership in British history. For decades, millions of families had lived in council houses, government-owned properties rented to working-class tenants. These communities were often well-built and well-maintained, but they created a culture of dependence on the state. Thatcher introduced the right to buy, allowing tenants to purchase their homes at substantial discounts. The response was overwhelming. Within a few years, over 1 million families had bought their council houses. Entire neighborhoods transformed as new homeowners invested in improvements, extensions, and gardens. Property values rose, creating wealth for families who had never owned assets before. Critics argued that this was just vote buying, giving away public assets to win electoral support. But Thatcher saw it differently. She believed that property ownership created a stake in society that went far beyond voting patterns. Homeowners cared about their neighborhoods, supported law and order, and wanted economic stability to protect their investments. The transformation was remarkable. Working-class communities that had voted Labour for generations started supporting conservative policies, not because they'd been bribed, but because their interests had genuinely changed. When you own your home, you care about property values. When you own shares, you care about company profits. When you have assets, you support policies that protect and grow those assets. This wasn't just happening to individuals. Entire institutions were changing. The City of London, Britain's financial center, was revolutionized by Thatcher's Big Bang reforms in 1986. Traditional practices that had restricted competition for centuries were swept away overnight. Foreign banks could compete directly with British institutions. Fixed commissions were abolished. Modern technology replaced ancient customs. The results were spectacular. London became the world's leading international financial center, attracting business from across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Thousands of new jobs were created. Tax revenues soared. Britain's invisible exports, financial and professional services became a major source of national wealth. But the changes went deeper than economics. Thatcher was reshaping British culture itself. The old class system, based on birth and background, was being replaced by a meritocracy based on achievement and enterprise. Grammar school children like herself could rise to the very top of society if they worked hard enough and seized their opportunities. This cultural shift was perhaps even more important than the economic reforms. Thatcher didn't just want to make Britain richer, she wanted to make it more dynamic, more entrepreneurial, more willing to take risks and embrace change. She believed that unleashing individual ambition would benefit everyone through increased prosperity and innovation. The evidence seemed to support her thesis. By the late 1980s, Britain was experiencing its longest economic expansion since the Victorian era. Unemployment was falling, productivity was rising, and living standards were improving for most of the population. The sick man of Europe had become one of the world's most dynamic economies, but success brought new challenges. The benefits of Thatcher's reforms weren't distributed equally. The old industrial regions, dependent on coal, steel, and manufacturing, struggled to adapt to the new service economy. Communities that had been stable for generations were disrupted by rapid change. London and the southeast boomed, but northern England, Scotland, and Wales often felt left behind. The gap between rich and poor widened, creating new social tensions. Critics argued that Thatcher's policies were creating a divided society where the successful prospered while the vulnerable were abandoned. Thatcher's response was characteristically direct. She believed that short-term pain was necessary for long-term gain. The old industries were dying anyway, killed by foreign competition and technological change. Government subsidies might delay the inevitable, but they couldn't prevent it. Better to encourage new industries and help people develop new skills than to prop up failing businesses. This philosophy extended to social policy as well. Thatcher famously declared that there was no such thing as society, only individuals and families. She wasn't denying that people had obligations to each other, but she was rejecting the idea that government was responsible for solving every social problem. Instead, she believed in what she called Victorian values: self-reliance, personal responsibility, hard work, and strong families. Government's job was to create the conditions for success, not to guarantee outcomes. People should be free to rise or fall based on their own efforts and choices. These ideas were spreading far beyond Britain. Ronald Reagan in America was implementing similar policies, dismantling government regulations and cutting taxes. But Thatcher's influence extended to unexpected places. Socialist governments in France and Spain began privatizing state industries. Communist countries in Eastern Europe studied her reforms as they planned their own transitions to market economies. The transformation was becoming global, and Margaret Thatcher was its leading architect. But her greatest triumph was still to come, in a confrontation that would reshape international relations and help end the Cold War itself. The year was 1989, and the Berlin Wall was crumbling. Across Eastern Europe, communist governments were collapsing like dominoes. And at the center of this historic transformation was Margaret Thatcher, wielding influence that extended far beyond Britain's borders. But here's what's fascinating. Thatcher didn't just watch the Cold War end, she helped orchestrate its conclusion. Her partnership with Ronald Reagan created the most formidable anti-communist alliance since World War II. While other Western leaders talked about peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union, Thatcher and Reagan believed they could actually win. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to contain communism, they would outcompete it. Thatcher's economic revolution in Britain proved that free markets could deliver prosperity on a scale that centrally planned economies simply couldn't match. When people behind the Iron Curtain saw what was happening in the West, they wanted the same opportunities for themselves. Thatcher's influence on Reagan was profound and often underestimated. She convinced him that Mikhail Gorbachev was different from previous Soviet leaders, someone they could work with to reduce tensions while maintaining pressure for change. When Reagan delivered his famous challenge to tear down this wall, he was echoing arguments Thatcher had been making for years. But the real proof of Thatcher's global impact came from an unexpected source. The countries that had once rejected everything she stood for were now copying her policies. China began introducing market reforms that looked remarkably similar to Thatcher's privatizations. India started dismantling the complex web of regulations that had strangled its economy for decades. Even more dramatically, the newly democratic governments of Eastern Europe turned to Britain for advice on how to transition from communism to capitalism. Polish economists studied Thatcher's privatization methods. Czech leaders invited British advisors to help design their stock exchanges. The woman who had once been dismissed as an extremist was now being treated as a visionary. The transformation wasn't just political or economic, it was technological. Thatcher's deregulation of telecommunications had unleashed a wave of innovation that was revolutionizing how people communicated. The internet, Mobile phones, satellite television, all of these technologies flourished in the competitive environment her policies had created. Think about this for a moment. The device you're probably watching this on, the global network that delivered it to you, the competitive marketplace that made it affordable, all of these things trace their origins back to the regulatory changes Thatcher pioneered in the 1980s. But perhaps her most lasting legacy was intellectual. Thatcher didn't just implement policies, she changed how people thought about the role of government itself. Before her, the assumption across the political spectrum was that government should play an active role in managing the economy. After her, the burden of proof shifted to those who wanted government intervention. This wasn't just happening in right-wing parties. Tony Blair's New Labour explicitly accepted many of Thatcher's reforms. Bill Clinton's Democrats embraced welfare reform and financial deregulation. Social democratic parties across Europe began privatizing state industries and reducing regulations. So there you have it. Margaret Thatcher didn't just change Britain, she rewrote the rules of how modern societies operate, from the privatizations that turned millions into shareholders, to the union battles that redefined political power, to the global spread of free market ideas that reshaped entire continents. The world you're living in today, with its emphasis on individual choice, competitive markets, and limited government, that's her world. Whether you love her or hate her, you can't escape the reality that Margaret Thatcher fundamentally altered the course of human history.